The world believed Elvis Presley had everything: fame, money, power, adoration. Everywhere he went, people screamed his name as if he were something more than human. Young women cried when they saw him. Men tried to imitate him. Newspapers followed his every move. Record stores could barely keep his music on their shelves. To millions of people, Elvis Presley was living a dream. But on a cold night in Germany, the truth was very different. Because while the world imagined a king sitting on a golden throne, Elvis Presley was sitting alone in the dark. And he was afraid. Not of enemies, not of failure, not even of death. He was afraid of being forgotten. The room was silent except for the ticking of a clock. Tick, tick, tick. Each sound seemed louder than the last. Elvis sat near a window, staring into the darkness outside. His military uniform hung neatly nearby. A guitar rested against the wall. Several unopened letters lay on a table. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Months earlier, crowds had chased him through airports. Now entire days passed without hearing a single scream, without seeing a single spotlight, without stepping onto a stage. At first, military service had seemed like an adventure, a temporary interruption, something he would finish before returning to his kingdom. But as the weeks became months, doubts began creeping into his mind. The music industry never stopped moving. New singers appeared every day. New songs climbed the charts. New faces filled magazine covers. And somewhere, deep inside, a terrifying question had begun poisoning his thoughts. What if America moved on without him? What if the king returned home and discovered there was no throne left? The thought haunted him, especially during nights like this, nights when there was nowhere to hide from his own mind. Outside the window, snow drifted gently through the darkness. Germany felt 1,000,000 miles away from home, 1,000,000 miles away from Memphis, 1,000,000 miles away from the life he understood. He closed his eyes, and immediately another face appeared. His mother, Gladys, the woman who had believed in him before anyone else, the woman who had loved him before the records, before the fame, before the world. The pain hit him as hard as ever. Time had not healed it. Nothing had. Not success, not money, not fame, not applause. Sometimes he still expected to hear her voice. Sometimes he still imagined picking up a telephone and hearing her answer. Instead, there was only silence. A silence that felt endless. He stood and walked slowly toward the kitchen. The loneliness followed him like a shadow. Few people understood this version of Elvis. The newspapers certainly didn't. To them, he was a superstar, a symbol, a phenomenon, a headline. But beneath the image lived a young man carrying grief he could never fully escape. A young man desperately searching for something real, something untouched by celebrity, something genuine. That night, a few friends planned to visit. Nothing unusual, just music, conversation, a chance to forget boredom. Elvis almost canceled. Part of him wanted to stay alone. Part of him wanted to disappear into the darkness and ignore the world for a while. Thankfully, he didn't, because destiny was already moving toward him, and neither of them knew it. Hours later, the house was alive with laughter. Music floated through the rooms. People talked over one another, glasses clinked, stories were exchanged. The atmosphere grew warmer. For the first time in days, Elvis found himself smiling naturally. Not the smile he used for cameras. A real smile. The kind that appeared unexpectedly. Yet despite the crowd, something still felt missing. An invisible emptiness lingered beneath the surface. Then it happened. The front door opened. Nobody reacted. Why would they? Guests had been arriving all evening. Just another person. Just another face. At least, that was what everyone thought. Years later, many people would wish they had paid closer attention to that moment, because history had quietly entered the room. A young girl stepped inside. She wasn't dressed like a movie star. She wasn't trying to attract attention. She wasn't surrounded by photographers. In fact, she looked completely out of place, almost as if she had wandered into the wrong house by accident. Her name was Priscilla Beaulieu, and at that moment she was trying desperately to control her breathing. Her heart felt completely out of control. The room seemed enormous. The voices seemed distant. Everything felt unreal. Because somewhere inside that crowded house stood Elvis Presley. Not the man on posters, not the face on album covers. The real Elvis. Suddenly she wanted to turn around, leave, run, anything. The pressure was overwhelming. But before she could move, Elvis looked up. Their eyes met, and the room disappeared. Not literally. The music still played. People still laughed. Conversations continued. Yet for a brief moment, everything seemed strangely far away. Elvis noticed something immediately. She wasn't behaving like everyone else. She wasn't pushing through the crowd. She wasn't staring at him with desperate excitement. She wasn't trying to impress him. Instead, she looked nervous, authentic, human, and that caught his attention instantly. For years, Elvis had lived surrounded by people who wanted something. Autographs, photographs, access, favors, attention. But authenticity had become rare, painfully rare. Something about this girl felt different. He couldn't explain why. He only knew he wanted to know more. Across the room, Priscilla felt frozen. She could hardly believe Elvis was looking directly at her. Then something happened that she would remember for the rest of her life. Elvis started walking toward her. One step, then another, then another. Every heartbeat felt louder. The distance between them shrank. Her mind raced. What do I say? What if I embarrass myself? What if I sound ridiculous? What if... Then Elvis smiled. Everything changed. It wasn't the famous smile seen by millions. It wasn't the performer. It wasn't the icon. It was something warmer, something genuine. And suddenly her fear began to fade. The conversation started simply, a greeting, a question, a laugh, nothing extraordinary. Yet within minutes, something unusual began happening. Both of them forgot about the room around them. Elvis found himself genuinely interested. Priscilla found herself relaxing. The conversation flowed effortlessly. One topic led to another, then another, then another. Hours seemed to vanish. At one point, Elvis noticed something strange. He was talking less like a celebrity and more like himself. That almost never happened. Most conversations felt artificial. Most interactions felt rehearsed. But this felt different. Dangerously different. Because for the first time in a very long while, he felt understood. And that realization frightened him more than he expected. Because deep inside, Elvis Presley had built walls. Walls designed to protect himself from disappointment, from betrayal, from heartbreak, from loneliness. Yet somehow, without trying, this young girl was slipping through them, and she didn't even realize it. The night continued. The laughter grew louder. Music filled every corner of the house. Then someone handed Elvis a guitar. The room erupted with excitement. Everyone wanted him to play. Everyone wanted a performance. For a moment, he hesitated. Then he sat down. His fingers touched the strings. The room became silent. A silence filled with anticipation. And when Elvis began to sing, something extraordinary happened. Not because of the song, not because of his voice, but because while everyone else watched the performer, he found himself watching Priscilla, watching her reaction, watching her smile, watching the way she listened. And for reasons he couldn't understand, nothing else seemed important. Not the records, not the fame, not the future. Just that moment, just that room, just that feeling. A feeling that destiny had quietly changed direction, and neither of them understood the price that would eventually come with it. Because before this story would become a fairy tale, it would first become a storm powerful enough to test love, fame, loyalty, and heartbreak itself. And before the night ended, Elvis Presley would make a decision that would keep him awake until sunrise. A decision that would become the first step toward one of the most famous relationships in entertainment history. The next morning, Elvis Presley woke up with a strange feeling. At first, he couldn't understand what was different. The room was the same. The house was the same. Germany was still cold. His military duties still waited for him. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt different. Then he remembered. Priscilla. The name appeared in his mind instantly. The memory of her smile, the way she listened, the way she looked at him without seeing a superstar, without seeing a celebrity, without seeing a king. She had simply seen a man. And somehow that thought stayed with him throughout the day. It followed him during military exercises. It followed him during conversations. It followed him through every quiet moment. The more he tried to ignore it, the stronger it became. That frightened him. Because Elvis Presley understood attention. He understood attraction. He understood admiration. Women had followed him for years. Entire crowds had screamed his name. None of that was new, but this felt different. Much different. This wasn't excitement. This wasn't ego. This wasn't celebrity. This felt personal. Dangerously personal. And deep down, he knew it. Days passed, then more days. But the memory refused to fade. Instead, it grew stronger. One evening, while sitting with friends, someone casually mentioned Priscilla. The reaction inside Elvis surprised him. Immediately, his attention sharpened. His heart beat faster. His mind became alert. It was as though someone had spoken the name of a person he had known for years. Yet only a short time had passed. The realization unsettled him, because for the first time in a very long while, he was looking forward to something. Looking forward to seeing someone. Looking forward to a conversation. That simple truth carried more power than he wanted to admit. Meanwhile, Priscilla was fighting a battle of her own. Back at home, life felt completely different. Nothing seemed normal anymore. She tried focusing on school, tried focusing on ordinary responsibilities, tried pretending everything was the same, but it wasn't. Everywhere she looked, memories of that night followed her. The conversations, the laughter, the music. Most of all, The version of Elvis nobody else seemed to know. The lonely version. The thoughtful version. The man hiding behind the legend. And that version was impossible to forget. Days turned into weeks. Then something happened. A message arrived. An invitation. Elvis wanted to see her again. The moment she heard the news, excitement rushed through her body, immediately followed by fear. What if the first meeting had been luck? What if things felt different now? What if she disappointed him? Questions flooded her mind, but none of them mattered, because despite every fear, she knew she would go. The evening arrived. Germany was wrapped in darkness once again. The same streets, the same cold air, yet everything felt different. When she entered the house this time, she wasn't a stranger, and Elvis noticed immediately. The nervousness was still there, but something else had appeared. Comfort. Trust. The evening unfolded naturally. Conversation flowed effortlessly. Hours vanished. Again. And again. And again. Each meeting seemed shorter than the last, not because time moved faster, but because neither wanted the moments to end. One night, after most guests had left, something unusual happened. The atmosphere became quiet, almost intimate. Only a few lights remained on. Music played softly in the background. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Elvis broke the silence, not as a celebrity, not as a performer, not as an icon, as a wounded young man. For the first time, he began sharing pieces of himself he rarely revealed. His fears, his doubts, his loneliness. The pressure of carrying expectations from millions of people. The exhaustion of constantly pretending to be strong. Priscilla listened carefully. She didn't interrupt. She didn't judge. She simply listened. And somehow that meant everything. Because very few people ever listened to Elvis Presley. Most people wanted something from him. Money, influence, access, attention. But she wanted nothing. And that made her incredibly dangerous. Dangerous because she was becoming important. Far more important than either of them realized. Weeks became months. The bond deepened. The conversations became longer. The silences became more comfortable. The connection became stronger. And with every passing day, Elvis found himself thinking about her more often, much more often. Sometimes before sleeping, sometimes immediately after waking up, sometimes during moments when he should have been focused elsewhere. The feeling was growing, and he could no longer deny it. Then reality arrived. Reality always arrives. One evening, Elvis sat alone after everyone had gone home. The house was silent, a familiar silence, but this time it felt different. He wasn't thinking about fame. He wasn't thinking about music. He wasn't thinking about his future career. He was thinking about Priscilla. And for the first time, a disturbing thought entered his mind. Where was all of this leading? The question refused to leave. Because no matter how powerful the connection felt, the world outside still existed. A world full of cameras, journalists, rumors, judgment. A world that loved building stories and destroying them. Elvis knew exactly how brutal that world could be. He had lived inside it for years. One headline could change everything. One rumor could spread across continents. One mistake could become permanent. For the first time since meeting her, Genuine fear entered his heart. Not fear of losing fame, not fear of criticism. Fear of losing her. Because now there was something to lose. That realization hit harder than expected. Far harder. Meanwhile, Priscilla sensed changes as well. The relationship was no longer a simple friendship. The emotions were becoming impossible to ignore. Each goodbye felt heavier. Each reunion felt more important. Each conversation carried greater meaning. Yet neither fully understood where destiny was taking them. Outside the house, the world continued moving. Reporters searched for stories. Fans dreamed about Elvis. Record executives discussed his future. America waited for his return. Nobody knew what was happening behind closed doors. Nobody knew that one of the most famous men on earth was slowly becoming emotionally attached to a girl in Germany. Nobody knew a story was being written. A story that would eventually fascinate millions. But destiny rarely asks permission. It simply moves forward, relentlessly. And soon, circumstances beyond their control would threaten everything they had built. Because military service would not last forever. Germany would not last forever. And the day everyone feared was approaching faster than either of them realized. The day Elvis Presley would be forced to leave. The day an ocean would suddenly separate them. The day a painful question would demand an answer. Was what they felt strong enough to survive the distance? Or would this become nothing more than a beautiful memory buried in the past? As Elvis stared out into the darkness that night, he had no idea. But deep inside, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. And hope, he would soon discover, could be far more dangerous than loneliness. The day Elvis Presley feared finally arrived. For months, Germany had felt like a strange chapter suspended outside of time. A place where the noise of fame had grown quieter. A place where he had rediscovered parts of himself he thought were gone forever. A place where destiny had introduced him to Priscilla. But now the chapter was ending. Orders had been given. Plans were being made. America was waiting. And Elvis Presley was going home. The news spread quickly. Friends celebrated. Business associates celebrated. Record executives celebrated. Millions of fans celebrated. The king was returning. Yet behind closed doors, the victory felt strangely painful, because every mile that brought Elvis closer to America would take him farther from Priscilla. Neither wanted to discuss it. Neither wanted to face it. But reality could no longer be avoided. One evening, they sat together in silence. No music, no crowd, no laughter. Only the sound of a clock quietly marking the passing seconds. For the first time since they had met, words felt inadequate. Because there are moments in life when no sentence is strong enough. No promise feels large enough. No reassurance feels convincing enough. This was one of those moments. Elvis stared toward the floor. Priscilla looked out the window. Neither wanted the night to end, because both understood something important. When morning arrived, everything would change. Outside, the streets were calm. Inside, emotions were raging like a storm. Eventually, Elvis spoke. His voice was softer than usual, almost uncertain. He told her something very few people ever heard from him. The truth. Not the truth the newspapers printed. Not the truth the public imagined. The real truth. He admitted he was scared. Scared of losing people. scared of disappointment, scared of waking up one day surrounded by millions of admirers and still feeling completely alone. The confession hung in the air, raw, unprotected, human. Priscilla listened carefully, and in that moment, she understood something many others never did. Behind the fame stood a man carrying enormous loneliness. A loneliness applause could never cure. A loneliness money could never erase. A loneliness that followed him into every room, every city, every hotel, every stage. For a few moments, neither spoke again. Then Elvis reached into his pocket. The gesture was simple, but the meaning was enormous. He made a promise. Not a public promise, not a dramatic promise. A private one. A promise that this would not be the end. A promise that distance would not erase what they had built. A promise that somehow, some way, they would remain part of each other's lives. The future remained uncertain, but hope still existed. And sometimes, hope is enough. The next morning arrived far too quickly. The farewell was painful, far more painful than either expected. There were no cameras capturing the moment, no headlines, no screaming crowds, only two people standing at the edge of a goodbye neither wanted. When they finally separated, neither knew exactly what would happen next, only that life was pulling them in different directions, and neither could stop it. Days later, Elvis returned to America. The reaction was explosive. Newspapers exploded with excitement. Fans flooded airports. Television programs celebrated his return. Record companies immediately began planning new projects. The machine of fame came roaring back to life, faster than ever, louder than ever. The world welcomed back its king, and from the outside, everything appeared perfect. But appearances can be deceptive, because even while standing beneath bright lights, part of Elvis remained thousands of miles away, in Germany, thinking about conversations, thinking about memories, thinking about someone who had entered his life unexpectedly. As months passed, his career soared once again. Hit records followed, movies followed, success multiplied. Everything the world expected happened. Yet something unusual also happened. He never forgot. Not the meetings, not the connection, not the feeling. Years later, fate would bring them together again. The promise made in Germany would not disappear. It would continue growing, slowly, quietly, relentlessly. Eventually, Priscilla would move to America. Eventually, their relationship would become public. Eventually, they would marry. And eventually, their story would become one of the most famous relationships in entertainment history. But life rarely gives people fairy tales without challenges. The years ahead would contain happiness. They would contain unforgettable moments. They would contain dreams fulfilled. Yet they would also contain struggles neither could fully anticipate. Because love alone cannot protect people from the pressures of fame. Love alone cannot silence public scrutiny. Love alone cannot stop time. Still, despite everything that happened later, one truth remained unchanged. The story began on an ordinary night, a night that seemed insignificant at the time. No reporters recognized its importance. No headlines predicted its consequences. No one in that house understood they were witnessing history. History often arrives quietly, without fanfare, without warning, without announcing itself. And that is exactly how destiny entered the room. Not with thunder, not with fireworks, not with a grand spectacle, but through a simple doorway in Germany. A doorway crossed by a nervous young girl who had no idea she was about to change the life of the most famous entertainer on earth. And perhaps that is what makes the story unforgettable, because it reminds us that life can change in a single moment. One conversation, one meeting, one unexpected glance across a crowded room. The world remembers Elvis Presley as a legend, a king, an icon, a once-in-a-generation superstar. But on that night in Germany, he was simply a young man searching for something real. And against all odds, he found it. The crowds never saw that moment. The cameras never recorded it. The newspapers never truly understood it. Yet it became one of the most important nights of his life. Because sometimes the events that change history are not the ones witnessed by millions. Sometimes they happen quietly, in a small room, on an ordinary evening, when fate opens a door and two lives walk through it together.